Um, yeah, it's a great honor to give a talk here in your online lecture series. And I will be talking about set theoretic reflection today. And some of what I will be talking about results from collaboration with my former colleague in Bristol, Philip Welsh. But nothing that I'm saying here and that is philosophical should be attributed to him. I will give my own philosophical views about set theoretical reflection, and I know that he doesn't share all of them, so don't attribute them to him, please. Okay, so it's going to be on set theoretic reflection that I'm talking about. Oops, sorry. Um, reflection is a concept that has a history and this history is found in philosophy and theology, Western philosophy and theology, at least to the extent that it's relevant for the talk today. And I think, these two a reflection in the history of the concept of reflection actually goes back to antiquity, I think, clearly. But I will not say much about the history of the concept of reflection today. I will say a few things about it that are relevant for what I'm going to talk about today. So I think two concepts of reflection should be distinguished from each other. On the one hand, we have an epistemic concept of reflection, and on the other hand, we have an ontological concept of reflection. And as I just said, both of these concepts of reflection go back to antiquity, philosophy, ancient philosophy, I would say. Now, there is an epistemic concept of reflection that I think most of us are somewhat more familiar with than with the second concept of reflection, which is an ontological concept of reflection. So the epistemic concept of reflection came on the foreground of philosophy in early modern times, so in the times of Locke and Leibniz. And I think the British empiricists in general, even though it has a longer history. And well, there it entered epistemology, as we would now call it. Of course, back then, epistemology was not clearly distinguished from other parts of philosophy, not as explicitly as it now is. But the idea is that we can reflect on our mental states. We can reflect on our thoughts. We can reflect on on our desires, and so on and so forth. Moreover, the idea was that somehow we have privileged access to the contents, to our own mental states. And of course, this idea then had the history of this idea then developed in the centuries after this 17th, 18th century. And today it has kind of grown into a chapter of contemporary epistemology, and that's the chapter of epistemology that concerns itself with introspection. And there again, this idea of, or the question whether we have privileged cognitive access to our own thoughts and other mental states. That's a prominent one. For instance, a point of reference here is probably Timothy Williamson's book, Timothy Williamson's now classic textbook on epistemology, where this is a chapter. But the epistemic concept of reflection is not going to play a big role in what I'm going to talk about today. Rather, I will talk about the ontological concept of reflection. And that is the notion of reflection in the sense of mirroring. That also has a history going back to to antiquity. I'm not going to talk much about the early history of this concept, but it is less familiar to us now than the epistemic concept of reflection because it's kind of dropped out of the canon of philosophy nowadays. And there's a reason for it. So, and that's the reason is the following. So the idea is that the large is reflected or mirrored in the small. That's kind of the core idea of the ontological concept of reflection. And it's ontological rather than epistemological because it's not really essentially connected to the human mind or even the divine mind, if there is such a thing. So it's an ontological concept of reflection, which has this core idea. And well, in Neoplatonism, this played an important role, but maybe its heyday in Western philosophy was in the Renaissance, when there were these Hermetic traditions where a lot of philosophical attention was given to the way in which microcosmos and macrocosmos mirror each other or are similar to each other. And one still good place to, if you're interested in this history, is Michel Foucault's first important book. So this is continental philosophy, but nonetheless, I think it's a very important work. Les mots et les choses, the words and the things. I don't know. I think it's in English. It's usually translated as the order of things or something like that, where he discusses this Hermetic tradition in the Renaissance in great detail. And some caution has to be applied to interpreting this as real history of ideas. I mean, the historians have question marks here and there, but I think it's still a very good, very, very, very important piece of work. Now, for instance, one example would be that the state, the political state, which is a sort of a macrocosmos, is reflected in the human body, or the human, and vice versa. Firstly, the human body is mirrored by the political state. That would be that was one idea that was pursued in those days in great detail. But after the Renaissance, Western philosophy has really moved away from this very decisively. The message that we got from, I think, early modern times onwards is that this idea of the large being reflected in the small in all kinds of domains is theoretically very unfruitful. And this had to do with the fact that they couldn't really restrain the notion of similarity or mirroring that's involved here. So everything is somehow similar to everything else. And, and this is just not a very theoretically fruitful way of arguing. And yeah, and then since those days, this ontological notion of reflection has just been dropped in Western philosophy, and it's now forgotten. So most students of Western philosophy won't even know about this Hermetic tradition in the Renaissance. It's considered just kind of a how would you put this? Yeah, an unfruitful direction that was pursued for a while and then rightly given up. Okay, but so that's as far as philosophy goes, and disciplines around it, such as theology, astrology, and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, it is known very well now that reflection is a very fruitful concept in logic and in set theory, and especially on some sort of ontological conception of reflection is very useful in set theory. And in this talk, I'm going to interpret set theory in a fairly naive Platonistic way. So reflection is a phenomenon that occurs all over the place in set theory, and the notion of reflection principle has played a fruitful role inside set theory. So there's kind of a little bit of a mismatch between the unfortunate history of reflection in philosophy over the last 500 years and somewhat successful history of something like this concept of reflection within a very rigorous discipline, namely set theory. Okay, so indeed, there are two kinds of reflection principles that have been pursued, that have been investigated since the late 1950s in the logical sciences. On the one hand, there are the proof-theoretic reflection principles. They are somehow connected to this epistemic notion of reflection that I talked about earlier, reflecting on the contents of your own mental states, for instance. Well, that is somehow related to the notion of reflection principles, and that's somehow related to the fact to the somewhat related to the reasons that we think we have for believing that proof theoretic reflection principles are generally very reliable. If we start from a mathematical theory and then formulate proof theoretic reflection principles for them, then they seem to be just as reliable, more or less. And that has to do with the fact that somehow reflection on the content of one's own beliefs can be very well expressed in terms of provability predicates for theories. Theories can have their own provability predicates, so this can be very well mimicked in proof theory. Okay, so there's a lot to be said about the philosophy of proof theory here that I'm not going to talk about. But there are also the set theoretic reflection principles. So these are the days of Richard Montague and Azrael Levy when they started to investigate proof theoretic and Georg Kreisel proof theoretic and set theoretic reflection principles at roughly the same time. And one question is, of course, is there a deep relation between these two kinds of reflection principle? That's a question that I'm not going to talk about today. But okay, so there are these set theoretic reflection principles, and there's received wisdom about set theoretic reflection principles that I will try to challenge to some extent in this talk. So the received wisdom is that set theoretic reflection principles are very well understood, and there's not really much need to do more research about them. And I disagree with this view, and I will try to explain in this talk why I disagree with that. But what's the received wisdom in a little bit more detail? They say, well, okay, set theoretic reflection principle, that was a theme in set theory from the 1950s and the 1960s mostly. And in these 2 decades, we have come to understand set theoretic reflection principles very well. In the previous decades, we've gained some more understanding of mathematical understanding of set theoretical reflection, but it was kind of confirming what we already thought in the 1960s as set theorists. So they're mathematically very well understood, and they're useful in some sense. So they have one reason why they are useful is that they have some set theoretic strength. So we have the basic principles of set theory, the axioms of Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory, including the axiom of choice. Axiom of choice won't play a big role in what I'm going to say. But we know that set theory is, like all mathematical theories, incomplete, not just because of Gödel's first and second incompleteness theorems, But also in the case of set theory, unlike, for instance, in the case of arithmetic, also in set theory, because of this extremely powerful mathematical technique that's called forcing. Okay, good. So we have a lot of questions that are just independent of the um, generally accepted principles of set theory, the axioms ZFC. So I would say that today there is in the mathematical community almost no doubt about any of the principles of Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory, including the axiom of replacement and the axiom of choice. They're seen to be they are taken to be absolutely reliable. When you go beyond this, it's less clear. Of course, if you want to reduce the set theoretic incompleteness, you have to go beyond this. You have to search for new axioms, as they're called. Okay, and these new axioms may be able to decide questions that you cannot decide on the basis of ZFC alone. And reflection principles can help a little bit. And I will illustrate in a little while how they can do this. But only to a certain degree. That's what most set theorists think. So they think, well, yes, so set theoretic reflection principles help us to reduce set theoretic incompleteness to a very limited degree. But if you want to eliminate set theoretic incompleteness in a much stronger sense, in a much wider sense, then you have to leave the set theoretic reflection principles behind, and then you need new resources. Moreover, since the 1970s, we've come to understand some of these new resources very well, and that's what we're now working with mostly, and the reflection principles don't really play much of a role anymore. One good thing about set theoretic reflection principles is that all set theorists find them, well, nearly all set theoretic nearly all set theorists find set theoretic reflection principles extremely plausible. Maybe not as plausible as the axioms of ZFC themselves, so the totally generally accepted principles of ZFC. But still, they find them very, very reliable, very plausible. And, and this is in contrast to some of these new tools about which I'm also going to talk in this lecture, which are seen by many set theorists are as very useful without any doubt, but where many set theorists would very much hesitate to say that they're true, to just claim that they're true. They would say, no, I'm not at all certain about this. I'm going to continue to use them, but the truth, that's another matter. Whereas for set theoretic reflection principles, most set theorists would say, yeah, that they're true. Okay, so that's the received wisdom, but my thesis is concerning reflection principles is that we know very little. I'm exaggerating here a little bit in this slide where I say, well, we know almost nothing. That's going a bit too far. Yeah, I'm sometimes prone to exaggerating. Well, here's a little exaggeration. But in particular, I think that the concept of set theoretic reflection principle should be a bit more controversial than it is. I think most people say, well, we know exactly what we mean by set theoretic reflection principle, what the concept is here. I think maybe there should be a debate about this. Secondly, so what kinds of reflection principles there are? Most people say, well, that's also pretty clear by now. I think that's also not so clear. There should be some more controversy about that than there is as well. Secondly, this claim about the strength of set theoretic reflection principle principles is also not clear. So the received wisdom, as I said a little bit earlier, is that that set theoretic reflection principles go beyond ZFC, but not very far. And I think that's not clear at all at the moment. And lastly, the plausibility of set theoretic reflection principles. So the idea is nowadays, since the 1980s at least, many philosophers of set theory think that set theoretic reflection principles are somehow intrinsically warranted. They enjoy intrinsic justification, whereas some of these newer tools, and they're called inner model embedding principles, they only have extrinsic warrant. So, and this intrinsic warrant is taken to be a warrant of an especially good kind somehow. Well, I'm also going to challenge this at the very end of this talk, I think. Okay, good. So what's the structure? Well, we're still in the introduction. I'm going to say something about set theoretic reflection now and set theoretic reflection principles. Then I'm going to talk about these new tools. These are called large cardinal principles in general, or strong principles of infinity, pretty much synonymous terms, I think. And then I'm going to spend some time on this question, how strong set theoretic reflection principles are. And I'm going to try to challenge this prevailing view that that you cannot get very far into the hierarchy of strong principles of infinity by means of set theoretic reflection principles alone. So I'm going to challenge this a bit. And towards the end, I'm going to say something about how we should interpret well, I mean, I'm going to make some suggestion. I'm going to borrow something from a colleague of mine here in Konstanz, Sam Roberts, a nice way of interpreting what set theoretic reflection principles really say. And then I'm also going to say something about this plausibility question. So I'm going to challenge this standard story of the intrinsic plausibility of set theoretic reflection principles. That's kind of the idea. Okay, so the background that I'll be drawing upon, and I have already been drawing upon it a little bit, is standard set theory. So the standard axioms of set theory, I'm going to assume that that the audience is more or less familiar with these basic principles. And also what standard set theory is about in a naive sense of the word. It's about the set theoretic universe, which is structured in layers. And these layers of the set theoretic hierarchy are called rank initial segments of the set theoretic universe. So I'm going to assume that a familiarity with the iterative hierarchy of sets and the difference between the set theoretic hierarchy as a whole and a rank initial segment of it. I'm also going to rely on the distinction between sets and proper classes that is motivated, of course, by the Russell paradox, and the consequence of this that that there is a distinction between first-order set theory and second-order set theory. So ZFC, as I put it above on the slide here, is a theory is a first-order theory where the quantifiers range only over the sets. So, but we know that there are proper classes, collections that are too big to be sets. Again, I'm kind of reasoning in a kind of a fairly naive Platonistic way here. There are things that are too big to be sets, such as, for instance, the class of all the ordinals, or, for instance, the class of all the sets. Well, our first order quantifiers, our ZFC quantifiers don't range over these kind of collections, but we can add a second collection of quantifiers called second order quantifiers that reach not just over the sets, but also over the proper classes. And then, of course, the first order quantifiers will be governed by slightly different laws than the second order quantifiers will be, because we have to be careful with reasoning about collections that are too big to be a set. So there's first order set theory, but there's also second order set theory, where the schemes, such as the replacement axiom, the replacement scheme of first order ZFC, is then replaced by a second order axiom, where the schematic parameter now becomes universally quantified over in a second order way. That's more or less what I'm assuming. Sorry for this coughing all the time. Okay, so now we can get to the question what reflection principles are. And this is more or less what the set theorists have decided in the 1950s, I would say, the late 1950s, maybe early 1960s. Then a consensus was reached that a set theoretic reflection principle expresses that the set theoretic universe as a whole is similar to one or more small parts of the set theoretic universe as a whole. And then these small parts are then, of course, the counterparts of the microcosmos of the Renaissance, let's say, and the set theoretic universe as a whole is a macrocosmos. So I think it's kind of curious that that this hopeless idea of the macrocosmos mirroring of the Renaissance, well, that the core idea behind it does make a lot of sense within the context of set theory. Okay, but then something has to be, certain things have to be made precise. What do you mean by a small part of the set theoretic universe? And then the set theorists decided that means a set-sized part. So it should not be too big to be a set, should not be a proper class. So for instance, the ordinals themselves are not a small part of the set theoretic universe as a whole, because there are proper class many of them. And then pretty much without laws of generality, you can identify set-sized parts, the notion of set-sized part with the notion of rank initial segment, V alpha, where alpha expresses the stage at which this rank is generated, the stage in the iterative hierarchy at which this rank is generated. But just as importantly, and actually more importantly, this notion of similarity somehow has to be constrained. And there, the set theorist says, well, this is going to be a notion, a semantic indistinguishability relation. So that means we're going to take the set theoretic universe as a whole, as a domain of discourse, but we're going to take a rank initial segment, V alpha, as another possible domain of discourse. And then the similarity between V and one of these rank initial segments, which is somehow similar to V, the similarity is then cashed out in terms of truth making. So they should make the same statements true. So if you've got a statement which is true when its quantifiers are interpreted as ranging over the whole set theoretic universe, then if this V alpha is properly mirroring, then if you take that initial segment as a more restricted domain of discourse, in which the quantifiers of this sentence phi are interpreted, it should still be true. And if originally it was false in the set theoretic universe, then when you restrict the quantifiers to this initial part, it should still be false. So that means that the similarity is expressed, is made more precise by saying that sentences from the language of set theory cannot distinguish the whole universe from some of its initial parts. So in this sense, so if something's true in the whole universe, it's true in one of the in one of these special initial parts, and vice versa. So that was the idea. And so this idea, as I said, dates back from the maybe late 50s, early 60s, but it still holds today. So Tony Martin has been one of the leading set theorists for the past 50 years or so. And in an article, I think this is in the 1980s or 90s, he expresses the concept of reflection principle as follows. He says, reflection principles are based on the idea that the class of all ordinals, ON, let's call it, is so large that for any reasonable property of the universe, ON is not the first stage where this property holds, or where this statement is made true. So this idea, this core idea of what a set theoretic reflection principle is, dates back from the, let's say, late 50s, early 60s, and it has remained pretty much unchanged, I think. Okay, so there are a couple of well-known set theoretic reflection principles that I want to discuss very briefly here. First of all, there's the Montague-Levy reflection principle. And that says that if you have, it's a first order schematic principle. So the language, so it's schematic, but the language over which the schematic parameter ranges is the language of first order set theory. And then it says, well, take any formula of this language of first order set theory. If it's true in the universe, then there is a rank initial, there is an ordinal alpha, such that if you reinterpret the quantifiers of phi as ranging over this initial segment V alpha, the result is still true. That's more or less the Montague-Levy reflection principle, studied around 1960 by Montague and Levy. And that's a reflection principle because it expresses a form of mirroring between truth in the universe, that's the antecedent, and truth in a set-sized initial segment of the universe. So it's a reflection principle in the core sense of the word. Secondly, we have Bernoulli's reflection, which is the natural second-order counterpart of this Montague-Levy reflection principle. So this is also a schematic principle, but here the parameter ranges not over the language of first-order set theory, but over the richer language of second-order set theory. It says if you have a sentence of that language, or a formula of that language, then there is an initial segment. Then there is an ordinal alpha, such that if you reinterpret the first order quantifiers of phi as ranging over this rank V alpha, and the second order quantifiers of this phi as ranging over V alpha plus 1, so the next stage of the iterative hierarchy, the result is also true. And of course, it is clear that Bernoulli's reflection implies Montague-Levy reflection. The vice versa, the other direction, is not at all clear at the outset, and indeed, this doesn't hold this converse implication. Okay, so that's reflection principles. There are more reflection principles. There are, for instance, variations of this idea by Bernoulli's, of these Bernoulli's reflection principles, but I'm not going to talk about them in detail here. Now I'm going to talk about these more recent tools. Let's say they start from I mean, late 1960s, 70s onwards, that are called strong principles of infinity, also known as large cardinal axioms. And this is a much more general notion. So the notion of a strong principle of infinity is described as follows. They are axioms that postulate the existence of sets that are too big to be provable in ZFC to exist. So they are sets with certain properties, and these, if something has these properties, it has to be somehow very big. But the standard axioms of first order set theory cannot prove these kinds of sets to exist. That's in general the concept of a strong principle of infinity. And since the axioms of first order ZFC do not prove them to exist, if a strong principle of infinity postulates them, they to some extent reduce set theoretic incompleteness. All right. So we have a whole lot of strong principles of infinity these days. And one remarkable thing is that they are more almost completely linearly ordered in terms of strength, And this could be consistency strength or outright strength, but let's focus on outright strength. And that just means that a stronger, if I call a set theoretic reflection principle stronger, then it implies the weaker ones. Okay, so there's a whole big collection of them, and I'm only going to talk about some of them. So there's on the weaker end of the strong principles of infinity, there is an axiom or a principle that postulates the existence of what are called weakly compact cardinals. I won't define what a weakly compact cardinal is here, but for a reason. There will be a reason for that. There is the axiom of measurable cardinals, which is also a strong principle of infinity, but it's a much stronger principle of infinity. So if you have the principle that postulates the existence of weakly compact cardinals, add this to your list of axioms, you cannot prove from that alone that there are measurable cardinals. But if you add the principle that postulates the existence of measurable cardinals to the standard axioms of first order set theory, then you can prove the existence of infinitely many weakly compact cardinals from that. So in that sense, measurable cardinals is stronger. And then you get the notions of supercompactness and extendability. So I'm going to skip these eta extendable cardinals and eta supercompact cardinals here for a second. They will come back a little bit later. But then the axiom of supercompact cardinals is kind of the next really big step up. So this is seen by many set theorists as kind of a watershed moment. I think most set theorists nowadays are comfortable with measurable cardinals, and they would be very well. I mean, they would be willing to bet a lot of money that they will never be shown to be inconsistent and so on. They trust them a lot, but when it comes to supercompact cardinals, many set theorists become a bit cautious, and they say, well, there I don't know. These are very strong principles, and we trust them a lot less as far as their truth goes than the axiom of measurable cardinals, for instance, and a fortiori so for the axiom of extendable cardinals. Okay, so what I want to focus on now is how these large cardinal axioms or strong principles of infinity are mostly formulated nowadays. And they are often formulated in class theory, so in second order set theory, as class embedding principles. So this is kind of a fairly uniform way of formulating the axiom of formulating strong principles of infinity. They can be miniaturized. You can get kind of first order approximations of these second order principles that are for most purposes just as good as the full second order principles, but I'm not going to talk about them a lot here. So there is a canonical way of formulating strong principles of infinity somehow, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit here. And this is in terms of inner models and elementary embeddings. So these are two concepts that are needed in order to formulate these strong principles of infinity. So I'm going to try to explain these concepts. I know that many of you know these concepts already, but my host told me that many of the students are not familiar with these concepts, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time explaining these models, these concepts. So these concepts, and then how you can get strong principles of infinity using these concepts. That's what I'm now going to talk about. So, we have the set theoretic universe that we're familiar with, but the first concept that we are going to define here is the concept of an inner model, which is kind of an approximation of the set theoretic universe. So what is an inner model? Well, an inner model, call it M of V, is a class such that it makes the axioms of set FC true, the first order axioms, let's say, and it contains all ordinals. So all the ordinals are elements of M. And that means that an inner model is a proper class. It's not a set, because it has to contain all the ordinals. And there are proper class many ordinals. Okay, so this is one concept. The second concept is the concept of elementary embedding. And well, there is the concept of one elementary embedding and two elementary embedding, and I will need both of these concepts, but let's talk about one elementary embedding. So this one and two refers to first order or second order elementarity. There is also third order elementarity and so on and so forth, but that won't play a role in what I'll be saying. I'll be talking about here. Okay, so what is an embedding function? It is a mapping from the whole universe V into an inner model M. So it's a mapping. And since V is a proper class, so is M. This mapping is going to be a proper class function from V into an inner model, such that for for every formula of the language of set theory, with one, let's say one free variable, this can of course be generalized. And for every set, V proves that phi is true of that set, if and only if the inner model proves that the image of that set under the embedding function is true in the inner model. So this is a notion of, again, indistinguishability. So that means that phi is true in V, if and only if phi is true in M, if phi doesn't have any free variables. And if it has free variables, well, then, so it's then truth of, so to speak, satisfaction. Then we replace phi of x, replace, when we move from V to M, x by its image under the embedding function J. So this is an indistinguishability notion, it's a semantic indistinguishability notion. And if this holds for first order sentences, then we have first order elementarity for our embedding function. If it holds not just for for all first order sentences, but even for all sentences that also quantify over proper classes, then we have a second order embedding function. So that's the second concept that we need. So this is again an indistinguishability relation. So it's related to this notion of indistinguishability, very closely related to this notion of indistinguishability that was part of the core idea of reflection principle. And that's going to be very powerful, a very powerful tool for articulating strong principles of infinity. Now, we want embedding functions which are non-trivial in the sense that they are not the identity function. They must move some element of the universe. Okay, so we're only going to be interested in non-trivial embedding functions. If we're not, then these principles lose their strength. We want there to be sets that are moved. Moreover, it can be shown that if any set is moved, then there will also be ordinals that have to be moved by an embedding function. Moreover, because of the well-ordering of the ordinals, if there is an ordinal that is moved, then there has to be a minimal ordinal that is moved, a first ordinal that is moved. And this first ordinal that is moved by an embedding function that is non-trivial is called the critical point of the embedding function. So these critical points are going to play a big role in strong principles of infinity, because these critical points of suitably chosen embeddings will be very large sets. There will be sets that are far too big to be provable to exist if you just have the ZFC axioms. Okay. Right, so let's see how we can use these concepts to express some strong principles of infinity, or also known as large cardinal axioms. So the prototypical example is the axiom of measurable cardinals. And the axiom of measurable cardinals just postulates that there is an inner model and a non-trivial embedding such that it maps V into this inner model. So it just said there is at least one way of non-trivially embedding the whole set theoretic universe into an inner model. So this inner model will, of course, be a part of V, but it will be a very big part of V because it contains all the ordinals. Now, if you postulate this, then you've postulate the existence of very big sets, because this non-trivial embedding will then have to have a critical point, a first ordinal that is moved. This first ordinal that is moved will be a cardinal, and moreover, it will be a very big cardinal called the measurable cardinal. This notion of measurable cardinal can be defined in many different ways, but this way of defining it is equivalent with other ways of defining it. And this is kind of a fairly canonical way of defining the notion of measurable cardinals, because it defines these large cardinals in a way that is very similar to the way in which other large cardinals can be defined. So that's the axiom of measurable cardinals. And the idea is then that, so this M is an approximation of phi. As I said, this inner model M is an approximation of phi. And you can get stronger embedding principles by imposing extra requirements on M and J, on the inner model M and the embedding function J, because those are the parameters with which you are playing when you're formulating large cardinal axioms in this framework, so to speak. For instance, you could say, well, I want to require of this inner model that we are talking about in the axiom of measurable cardinals, that it is closed under long sequences, where the length of a sequence is, of course, measured by an ordinal. So this is, let's say, an ordinal theta. So that means that if you have a sequence of ordinals, each of which are a sequence of elements of M, then the whole sequence seen as a set will also have to be an element of M. So that means that M is closed under taking sequences of length theta. Well, that's an extra requirement. So before we only had required that there is a non-trivial embedding function and an inner model, but now we're requiring, in addition, something more of this inner model that is not somehow nicely closed up in a certain way. If we do that, then we get a stronger axiom, the axiom of theta supercompact cardinals. And if you take your theta large, then actually the axiom that you're postulating in this by adding this extra requirement is much stronger than the axiom of measurable cardinals just by itself. And then you can take this to the limit. You can say, well, okay, we call a cardinal outright supercompact. So kappa is, okay, and then of course, again, the critical point of this non-trivial embedding function will then be the theta supercompact cardinal that you've postulated. If you can take this to the limit by saying that, well, a cardinal is outright supercompact if it's theta supercompact for every theta. So that means that you're closing up your your inner models ever more, ever more. So it's not just one supercompact, but also two supercompact, and it's also three supercompact, and it's also four supercompact, and so on and so forth, all the way through the ordinals. Then you've got an outright supercompact cardinal, and that's postulating the existence of a supercompact cardinal is a much stronger requirement than postulating the existence of a measurable cardinal only. Okay, so that's measurable cardinal, that's supercompact cardinals. And then in the end, we also have the notion of an extendable cardinal. And well, again, this is the notion of extendability is defined in a similar way to the notion of supercompactness. You start from the notion of theta or eta extendable cardinals for eta here a given ordinal, and then you say a cardinal is extendable if it is eta extendable for every eta. Well, the notion of eta extendable cardinals says that, well, there is a zeta and a non-trivial embedding and an inner model such that v kappa plus eta is embedded by J elementarily into the inner model M, the initial segment of the inner model M up to level zeta. And then in this formula, in this formulation, kappa is again the critical point of the embedding. So that means that okay, means what it says. But here, this is an example of a miniaturized version of an embedding principle, because what is involved here is phi kappa plus n plus eta that is set sized. It's an initial segment. M zeta is also set size because it's a rank initial segment of an inner model of M. That makes this embedding function also set sized. So the whole thing is here first order, but it's still very, very, very strong. So just to show that it's not just the second orderness of what we're doing that makes all this stuff strong. Okay, so far so good. So we've got these notions, and there are many other large cardinal axioms or strong principles of infinity. Most of them have an inner model embedding formulation along the lines of what of what we've seen for measurable cardinals, supercompact cardinals, and extendable cardinals. Not all of them, but most of them. So this hierarchy of strong principles of infinity is proper. So for instance, you can prove that yeah, that the least measurable cardinal has to have lots of weakly compact cardinals below it. Large cardinals are used all over the place in contemporary set theory, even the larger ones, such as supercompact cardinals. They play a really big role in constructing models for certain forcing principles and what have you. They reduce incompleteness, but many set theoretic problems are not decided by large cardinal axioms, and we know this already by since the 1960s, because there are fundamental reasons why certain types of problems cannot be decided by these types of principles, the strong principles of infinity. And of course, the famous case here is the continuum hypothesis. Okay. Now, one first thing to notice, so we've got these reflection principles on the one hand, and we've got these strong principles of infinity on the other hand, and they are uniformly formulated or quasi-uniformly formulated as embedding principles. But these embedding principles are not reflection principles, according to the core idea of reflection principles, set theoretic reflection principles, as kind of fixed, let's say, in the early 1960s. And yeah, so for instance, measurable cardinals or supercompact cardinals, we see that this is because the reflecting object is not small, right? So let's say we talk about the prototypical case, measurable cardinals. Then the reflected object is phi. It's reflected in an inner model M. M is a proper part of phi, but it's not small. It's a big part of phi because it's also proper class size. It has all the ordinals in it. And then for some other ones, so for instance, the embedding, the axiom of extendability that I've talked about, the reason why that is not a standard embedded, not a reflection principle, excuse me, is that this is reflecting of the small in the small, right? So the v kappa plus eta is small, and the m zeta is also small. So there's it's not a reflection of the big into the small or the small into the big. So that's the way things are. That's the way I think set theorists understand these things. I may be wrong, but then I would like to be corrected. But one question here is whether that is the right attitude to take, because I've heard some set theorists say, just in the corridors in conversation, well, you know, these embedding principles, they're also reflection principles. I mean, they don't say this as far as I know in any of the published articles, if there would be published articles by leading set theorists where they call some of these inner model embedding principles reflection principles, and I would like to know. And the reason is that I'm not so sure whether our standard concept of reflection principle should be taken so strictly as the researchers in the early 1960s have fixed this. So one question is, well, don't we have a good case for conceptual explication in the sense of Carnap here, or conceptual engineering, to use more contemporary terminology, and say, well, actually, we want to liberalize the concept of reflection principle so that standard embedding principles also belong to it. And that would be by saying, well, the whole should be reflected into a proper part, but this proper part shouldn't have to be, in some sense, infinitesimally small compared to the big thing. And You know, if you're Carnap, you would say, well, it depends on which concept is scientifically more fruitful. So it may be that the standard conception of reflection principle, as fixed, let's say, by Montague, Kreisel, Levy, and these kind of people, um, is well, it may be the case that that concept is, well, we know that that concept, well, actually, I don't know if you know, but it may be that that concept is not as fruitful as the embedding principle concepts. And the embedding principle concept is not very far away from the core reflection principle concept. So maybe there's a case of liberalizing the concept and counting the standard embedding principles, for instance, the embedding formulation of the axiom of measurable cardinals as a reflection principle. So this is my first point of critique to the received wisdom, that maybe we shouldn't be too sure that we've hit upon the right concept of reflection principle already around 1960. Okay, maybe we can talk about this in the discussion. But in any case, now we move to a second question, and that is that once you know that we can get to some extent that we can get some strong principles of infinity as consequences of reflection principles, you can ask how high in the hierarchy of strong principles of infinity can we get by set theoretic reflection principles? That's a game. So this idea of liberalizing the concept of set theoretic reflection principle, I'm not going to push anymore in the rest of the talk. I just wanted to throw it out as something maybe to think about at some point. But one question is, how high in the large cardinal hierarchy do natural, relatively simple, and plausible set theoretic reflection principles reach? We know that they reach a little bit into this because the Bernoulli's reflection is actually properly stronger than the principle that postulates the existence of weakly inaccessible cardinals. By the way, the principle of weakly inaccessible cardinals also has many equivalent formulations, and one of them is again one of these embedding formulations. So we know we can get some large cardinal strength, and that means we can get some reduction of incompleteness. The question is how much? And in some sense, if these set theoretic reflection principles are somehow have a privileged epistemological status, then this is a question that has some philosophical interest, because then we could reduce set theoretic incompleteness in a very well motivated way if we can reach high into this hierarchy of large cardinal principles by means of set theoretic reflection principles. So this is a question. And Gödel already was aware of this being an important question, certainly in the 1960s. And he has a very optimistic view on this. And so this is considered by many people nowadays a very extreme position and somewhat and a very unlikely position. But he conjectured that all strong principles of infinity are, in the final analysis or ultimately, derivable from set theoretic reflection principles. So already in the 1960s, people were you know, these strong principles of infinity were proliferating. Some of them were shown to follow from set theoretic reflection principles, for instance, weakly compact cardinals. But Gödel made a very bold conjecture and said it doesn't just hold for these weakly compact cardinals, but anything that these people, any strong principle of infinity that you'll be able to come up with, that has any plausibility at all, that is plausible will be shown to follow from a set theoretic reflection principle and therefore be strongly warranted. So here's a quote. Let's see. Okay. He says, generally, I believe that in the last analysis, every plausible axiom of infinity should be derivable from the extremely plausible principle that phi is indefinable, where definability is taken in a more and more generalized and idealized sense. And the principle that phi is indefinable is, of course, a reflection in accordance with the idea of the core idea of a set theoretic reflection principle. So that's a very optimistic conjecture. On the other side of the spectrum, you have people such as Peter Kullner, but also Bill Tate and other people who are much more pessimistic. And I believe that that this is where the majority of the philosophers of set theorists are at the moment located. So they think, well, Gödel is much too optimistic. So Peter Kullner has claimed or has conjectured, well, has argued in much detail that no plausible set theoretic reflection principle entails the existence of measurable cardinals, because he says every set theoretic reflection principle will be compatible with Gödel's axiom V equals L. And V equals L is incompatible with the existence of measurable cardinals. So if these people are right, and then the received wisdom is really correct, and then there's really a strong limit to how a very hard and fairly low limit to what you can, how far you can reach into the large cardinal hierarchy by reflection principles. And then you won't be able to reduce set theoretic incompleteness much by making use of set theoretic reflection principles. Okay, good. So those are the two positions. And well, I think so. Philip Welsh. So now I'm coming to work by Philip Welsh. He came up, I think, must be around 10 years ago now, with a principle which can be seen as which I will argue can be seen as a reflection principle, and which entails the existence of measurable cardinals. And if this really is a reflection principle, then the pessimists are too pessimistic. What does this principle say? This axiom of Philip, he says, well, there is an elementary embedding and an ordinal kappa, such that if you take the initial segment V kappa and V kappa plus 1, where V kappa is the domain of your first order quantifiers and V kappa plus 1 is the domain of your second order quantifiers, as before. And then this embedding takes this structure, maps this structure into the whole universe V and all of its proper classes. And this embedding is is going to have to be yeah, non-trivial again as before, and it's a second order elementarity that this embedding enjoys, in the sense that a formula, a second order formula phi, is true of a set X in the little structure V kappa plus 1, if and only if J of if phi is true of the image of that set under J in the big structure, phi and all of its proper classes. Okay, so this is a principle. You can again, it's a second order principle. You can add it to the principles, the standardly accepted principles of set theory, and then you can show that from this principle, within this context, the existence of one extendable cardinals follows. So the existence of many measurable cardinals follows from that, and that So if this is a reflection principle, then people like Kellner and Tate are not right. Um, well, why would this be a reflection principle? Well, let's see, yes. So what my claim here is, well, it is a reflection principle. And why do I say this? Because our, you know, our objection to calling the embedding formulation of measurable cardinals a reflection principle consisted in the fact that it was a reflection not between a big structure and a small structure, but two big structures, V and an inner model of V, M, which contains all the ordinals, so it's just as big given global choice. But here we are in a different situation because here the domain of the embedding function J is a set size structure. So it is V kappa plus 1. Well, that's set size. That's infinitesimally small compared to the reflected structure V with all of its classes, which is yeah, more than proper class size. So so this objection to calling the standard embedding formulation of measurable cardinals a reflection principle does not apply here anymore. That's the main reason. But one can ask a further question, and that is, what about this J, this embedding function? So we have here the postulation of an embedding function. And if we think back of the core idea of what a reflection principle is, it just says that the big is reflected into the small. We have big and small here and reflected cashed out in terms of semantic indistinguishability, but there's no mention in this core idea of a mapping that mediates the the indistinguishability. That's absent of it. That's not present in the core idea. And if you remove it from an axiom such as Welsh reflection or the standard formulation of the axiom of measurable cardinals in terms of elementary embeddings, then you get a weak principle, and a weak principle to which the Kellner conjunction applies. I mean, it will be compatible with V equals L. So this postulate, this mediating the indistinguishability by an embedding relation plays an essential role. Okay. So Kellner may, after all, still be right, maybe. But so at this point, the story gets a little more complicated, and I won't go into the details. I think this can be handled, and in the following way. So my colleague here in Konstanz, Sam Roberts, he has formulated a reflection principle. Again, it's a second order reflection principle, which does what Welsh's reflection principle does. So it postulates the existence of one-extendable cardinals without making any mention of the without using the concept of an elementary embedding. So we can get around to we can get around using the concept of an elementary embedding in postulating reflection principles like the one that Philip Welsh came up with. So that's one reason, I think, for saying that, well, the mention of an embedding function in Welsh reflection principle, that's not completely, that's not essential to what's going on here. Okay, and that will also apply to things that I'm going to talk about now. And it seems that I'm talking longer than I thought I would be talking, but that's probably a good thing, I hope. Okay, so I'm not going to go into the details of that here. But then the next question is, what about this watershed moment of supercompact cardinals, where many set theorists will say, well, you know, this is useful. I'm going to work with these things, but I'm not going to say I'm not going to trust them to the extent that I trust the axiom of measurable cardinals, where I think there, you know, never will a contradiction be found from measurable cardinals, but supercompact, who knows? Many set theorists. Yeah, I think would say something like that when pushed. Well, it turns out that you can also you can do something Welsh-like also for supercompact cardinals. And what you do is like you do what you do with measurable cardinals. You say, okay, there has to be an elementary embedding. No, you do something like what you do with Welsh reflection. You say there has to be an elementary embedding from a set-sized part, so a small part of V alpha, into V as a whole, which is absolutely humongously big. It's a proper class. So it's a reflection between the big and the small. It's mediated by an embedding function as a non-trivial one, as a critical point. But we are going to require something about the image of this critical point. And that is that the image of this critical point is going to have to be high up in the iterative hierarchy. It has to be above V alpha. If you do that, then this image of the critical point will be a supercompact cardinal. That as Philip proved, adapting an old argument of Magidor. Actually, the argument is not that complicated. So, for instance, yeah, so with the axiom of measurable cardinals, you also move already with the core the paradigmatic case of an embedding formulation of a large cardinal principle, namely the one for measurable cardinals. This critical point has to be moved, but it doesn't have to be sent very, very high up into the iterative hierarchy, whereas here this axiom P does require that. And this turns out to be a very big extra demand. And if you make this extra demand, then you're really postulating the existence of supercompact kernels. So the set theoretic reflection principles reach even higher into the large cardinal hierarchy. So they reach up to the supercompacts, supercompact cardinals. That's quite far. So then the next question maybe, I mean, there may be intermediate questions that I'm not aware of, but what about extendable cardinals? And as far as I know, this is open. But that's it. At this point, I think it's genuinely open. It's not ridiculous to try to look for a set theoretic reflection principle which entails the existence of extendable cardinals. I think it's worth thinking about. And again, so I think this is a little bit more progress. We're trying to slowly climb up in the hierarchy of strong principles of infinity using simple, natural, and somewhat plausible reflection principles. Okay, so now I'm getting to the last part of this talk. How should we think about these things? About what reflection principles are really saying. And here I'm going to draw upon a few ideas of Sam Roberts, my colleague here in Konstanz, but it's unpublished work. I mean, you won't find it in his published work yet, but at some point his paper will, I'm sure, come out. So the idea is that a reflecting structure is kind of a play in the theatrical sense, in the theater sense of the word. So and what this play is about is yeah, okay. Well, let me try to gather my thoughts here. So the idea is that of set theoretic reflection is that you've got uh, 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 a big structure, let's say V, and maybe V and all of its classes or something like that, but something proper class sized, class sized, and in some sense, this is enacted into a little play, and this play is given by the reflecting structure. Now, in a play, you have actors, actresses. And these actresses, they play a role. And what role they play is given by the elementary embedding function. So, so if you have a little structure V alpha plus 1, then all of the elements in this little reflecting structure are mapped to the universe as a whole. And the function value of a set tells you what role this set is playing in this little play in the reflecting that the reflecting structure is. And some things play themselves. They have a trivial role. So, for instance, in these in standard embedding principles, if you're below the critical point, if you're a set below the critical point of the embedding function, then you're mapped onto yourself. So that means that you're not really playing a trivial role. You're just playing yourself. And in plays, we do have these kind of things. So, for instance, you could have a table on a stage which is just a table. It doesn't play the role. It doesn't stand for something else. It's just a table. So it plays itself. But you can also have, let's say, an actress on the same stage who plays the role of being the Queen of England in the 17th century or something like that. Then she plays a non-trivial role. So the table plays a trivial role because it's mapped to itself. But this actress plays a non-trivial role. She plays the role of someone else in this world, the Queen of England, let's say, outside the stage. So, in this case, but what you can also have is that you can have actors on the stage that play a non-trivial role of being another actor on the stage. So they play a non-trivial role, but it's still an immanent role. The role is immanent to the play. So one actor, let's call this actor Bob, can in the play the role of another actor, let's say Roger, who's also an actor in the play. So that's playing an immanent role. But some elements play being an element outside the reflecting structure. So for instance, if we've got this actress playing the Queen of England, and the Queen of England is not on the stage itself, then she plays a transcendent role. So we can think of this reflection phenomenon in terms of playing roles, where the role is given by this embedding function J. Okay, so if we do that, then so we can think of each of the reflection principles that we've looked at, the weak ones and the stronger ones, and also some of the ones that I haven't discussed. So for instance, Sam Roberts' own strong reflection principle, we can think of it in these terms. And if we look at the strongest reflection principle that I've discussed here, this principle that I've called P, well, it says that well, let's go back to it. That that the critical point, so what is anything that is not playing, um, and even more general, anything that's not just playing itself, it's just not that does more than playing a trivial role, has to be mapped above alpha, so that you won't find it in V alpha. So that means that um, um, that it plays a transcendent role. So that means that according to the axiom P, you've got only actors that play trivial roles, like our table, and our actress who plays the role of something that is outside the stage itself. Okay. So if we consider ourselves to be radically bound to the reflecting structure, and this is something that maybe some forms of potentialists might be interested in. So I'm not a potentialist myself, but maybe they might be interested in this. If we consider ourselves to be radically bound to the reflecting structure in the sense that that's our world, that's all we can quantify over, then this principle P, that in some sense postulates the existence of supercompact cardinals, maybe a little bit more, can be interpreted as saying that via this embedding function J, we have symbolic access to many transcendent objects that we cannot even quantify over. And well, I mean, this is just kind of the germ, maybe of an idea of an interpretation of set theoretic reflection here. And yeah, so but as I said, so this idea is due to Sam Roberts, but I don't think as far as I remember, he doesn't make this distinction between immanent and transcendent roles, which may be interesting. Okay, so to close completely about there's this question about the plausibility of these reflection principles. So this all looks very good because so far, because if we have this piece of wisdom that set theoretic reflection principles are intrinsically plausible or intrinsically warranted, because that means we would have a strong warrant for very strong principles of infinity. But there I'm a little bit doubtful. So maybe it would be great if I could draw this epistemological conclusion, but I'm not sure if I can. Actually, I'm a bit doubtful if we can. So most set theorists find set theoretic reflection principles plausible. So here's Penelope Maddy, one of the leading philosophers of set theory for many decades now. She says reflection argumentation is probably the most universally accepted rule of thumb in higher set theory, where rules of thumb are vague intuitions about the nature of sets, intuitions too vague to be expressed directly as axioms, but which can be used in plausibility arguments for more precise statements. Okay, so why is that so? So why are they so, do they have somehow privileged warrant? The reason is that, according to many philosophers of set theory, is that set theoretic reflection principles are intrinsically warranted. So there's this distinction between intrinsic warrant for axioms and extrinsic warrant for axioms, a distinction that goes back to Gödel. And then the idea is that the whole iterative conception of a set is somehow intrinsic to the concept of set. Maybe also ideas about limitation of size are intrinsic, but also richness considerations, that the set theoretic universe is somehow maximally rich. This is also an idea that's been pursued quite a bit by Penelope Maddy. So we've got those ideas, and they are supposed to give strong support, but we also have extrinsic justification, and within that there is a distinction between external, extrinsic success arguments. There we're in the domain of Quine and Putnam, not going to talk about that here, and internal success arguments. So for instance, and these kind of support have been adduced or attributed to inner model embedding principles. They say, well, they are not intrinsically plausible. It's intrinsically supported as far as we know. But if we accept these strong principles of infinity as given by, let's say, embedding principles, or in other ways, we get a very beautiful, an extremely beautiful mathematical structure where everything hangs together very well, and where questions get natural answers, and so on and so forth. So this is kind of an internal, within mathematics, success argument. Well, and then if I mean the hope of principles push, or the hope of people pushing reflection arguments and reflection principles in set theory is that we can get intrinsic warrant for very strong principles. But now I want to, at the end, throw doubt on this. So you could say, I mean, and these people would maybe say, I don't know if Penelope Medi would still say something like this now. So maybe I shouldn't attribute this to Penelope Medi right now, but set theoretic reflection principles are intrinsically justified. The idea is that phi with its classes is undefinable, but there are many true statements about phi and its classes, so they must all be reflected in small parts of phi. But why should we believe that the set theoretic universe is so rich that it's very strongly undefinable? So this seems to be this richness statement that seems to be a rock bottom statement for the people who want to provide warrant for reflection principles. But why should we believe that the set theoretic universe is rich in these particular ways that it has to be in order to make these reflection principles true? And there I just don't see an intrinsic answer to this question. And the best I can do is to say, well, how to put this? So is to say, well, if we do accept these kind of principles, reflection principles, well, then we get in a very nicely organized way a beautiful theory which reduces set theoretic incompleteness in natural ways, and answers our questions in natural ways. But that's again an extrinsic way of arguing. So ultimately, I think that our support for set theoretic reflection principles is extrinsic rather than intrinsic. So I'm optimistic about what we can do with set theoretic reflection principles, how far we can reach into the hierarchy of strong principles of infinity, but the epistemic import of that, I'm not so optimistic about. And yeah, I think that's all I have to say, and I thank you very much for your attention. Looking forward to your questions.